Hello and welcome to today's OWASP Switzerland chapter meeting. My name is Rob and I'm very happy to welcome you together with my colleagues Patrick and Sven. You can find our upcoming events on our chapter page. Are you thinking about giving something back? How about becoming a member? It has never been easier. And now, without further ado, I turn it over to you, Simon.
My name is Simon Bennett. I'm the Zap project founder. I'm one of the project leads, and I'm here to talk about Zap automation in CI/CD. I actually work at Stackhawk, where we're building a commercial product on top of Zap, but I won't be talking about that at all for the rest of this talk. So for this talk, what I wanted to do was give a quick overview of Zap for those of you who don't know very much about it. Then I'm going to dive into the different ways you can automate Zap. And then I'll talk about the automation process. And by that, I mean the kind of things you need to think about, the kind of things you need to worry about, and the orders of doing things. Then I'll talk a little bit about Zap configuration, because I think it helps in this particular case. And then I will talk about the automation framework, which is something which we're working on at the moment, but which will be very relevant, hopefully fairly soon. So what is Zap? Always a good place to start. So it is a tool for finding vulnerabilities in web applications. And I think the key thing here is that it's all about finding essentially it's vulnerabilities in custom web applications. So if you've come from a kind of networking world, network security world, you may be aware that quite a few network scanners work on the basis that they're looking for known vulnerabilities in known applications. And that's clearly a very useful thing, and there are equivalents in the web world. So, if you're running a WordPress site, then it's really good to be alerted if you've got any Zap will find some known vulnerabilities, but really it's looking for unknown vulnerabilities or new vulnerabilities in custom web applications. That means it's not looking for signatures of things. It is actually trying to attack your target application in a similar way that a malicious attacker would do. And that means, even if you're looking at application that no one's ever seen before, it will still be able to find potential vulnerabilities. So it's looking for things like your cross-site scripting, SQL injection, all those kind of wonderful things. Zap is an OWASP flagship project, and the flagship projects are the ones that are most mature and the ones that are recommended for you to actually start using when as you start on your security journey. So it's been around for 10 years now, and it is a pretty mature project. It is like all OWASP projects. It is completely free and open source. And it is cross-platform. So as long as you have a Java VM, you'll be able to run Zap. I've even got it running on a Raspberry Pi if you want to try that. It didn't run particularly fast, but it still did run. And it is well maintained. And this is something I think is very important. With any kind of security tool, it really, as soon as they stop being maintained, then they gradually become less and less useful. And there have been quite a few open source web security scanners over the years, but there are very few which are actually actively maintained. And I think it's no doubt that Zap is the best maintained open source web security tool out there at the moment. And we believe it is probably the world's most frequently used web scanner, and that includes commercial tools as well. This is something we went public on a while ago, and I might well have pointed a few of our competitors at our statement. So it's on our blog, and nobody has argued against it. So that means it must be true. And so who is Zap for? It is, when I released Zap all those years ago, over 10 years ago now, I was definitely aiming it at developers and functional testers. That was the target audience, and I think is the audience particularly for automation when we talk about CI/CD as well. But Zap is great for students. So as an open source tool, it's something that the students can have a look at. They can see how it works and they can get involved as well. So we've had lots of students volunteering to work on Zap, either through projects like the Google Summer of Code, Mozilla Winter of Security, a couple of OWASP events as well, but also students have contributed as part of their courses. So they've written the Zap add-ons as part of their coursework, and so we've mentored a whole load of students directly and indirectly via a whole load of different projects and different setups. But it is also great for security professionals as well. And I think the way I see it is that developers and functional testers, then Zap is quite possibly the only web security tool they'll need. Whereas with security professionals, you should be using, as I'm sure you should be using, you should know about all the best tools, and you should know their strengths and weaknesses, and you should know when to use them. So if you are a security professional and you do web testing and you don't use Zap, then I'm going to claim you're wrong. I'm not saying you should use Zap all the time. I'm not saying you should use Zap in any particular case, but you should know what Zap's strengths and weaknesses are, because it does have some strengths, and it's stronger than a lot of probably any commercial tool, particularly once you get into the automation and scripting capabilities. So if you don't know what you can do with Zap, then you are missing out. So the first one is the command line, and Zap has quite a few command line options. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to my browser, because we have a lot of documentation online. So this is zaproxy.org, and if you go to documentation, then you'll see we've got the desktop user guide. And this is probably the fullest amount of documentation we have about Zap, but there's lots of information on zaproxy.org. And one thing you will find on the first page is a link to the command line. So these are the command line options that are built into Zap. And Zap has a kind of plugin architecture, and this means that add-ons can add their own command line options. And we've got so these are the kind of the ones supported by the core, but then there'll be a whole load which different add-ons can add. So I will point out a couple of things here, because there are different ways of running Zap, and we have these switches, command and daemon. So if you run Zap without either of those two options, then you will start the Zap desktop. If you run it in daemon mode, then the same thing happens, but you don't get the desktop. Zap is running, but it runs headless, so without a UI. And then if you run Zap with the -command option, Zap will actually do whatever you tell it to and then will exit. And that is kind of the first option. I'm going to talk about the command line option for doing a scan, but I also want to point out these configuration options, and we'll get to those a bit later. So what you can do is you can actually specify Zap options via the command line, which is particularly useful in automation. But what I'm going to do is switch over to the command line, which I think if I go here, the command line option I've given in the slides. So what I'll do is I will now go over to my terminal, and I should have that command. Yeah, so because I'm on a Mac, Zap is installed on Applications OS Zap, and to actually run the script, you need to go to Contents Java. But then we've got this option for a quick URL, and that is you give the URL, and an option for quick progress as well. And here's the command line because I want Zap to actually exit, and I don't want the desktop. So if I just press that, then there's actually on the Mac for some reason there's a bit of a startup delay. I'm not sure why. I'll have to look at it at some point. If you run when I'm running Docker, you'll see Zap actually starts up much more quickly than this. So I could have done this from the command line in Docker, but I want to show the Docker side separately. But what Zap will now do is it will, there we're going accessing the URL, and we're using the traditional spider, and then we've started active scanning. And because I've done the progress option, you'll see that you'll see the progress. And I'm not going to bother actually letting this run to completion because it will take too long. But what I will do is I will now actually switch to the Zap desktop, because this is actually very analogous to the automated scan option you've got here. So you give the URL to attack, but in this case, from the command line, you've only got the option to use traditional spider. You don't have the option to use the Ajax spider. And it's for this reason I don't actually recommend people use this command line option in Anger. So I don't recommend that you use the quick line command line quick scan option, because there are so few options. The next one, which you've already seen, is the Jenkins plugin. Now, despite the documentation, how the documentation appears at the moment, the Zap Jenkins plugin is no longer supported, and we do not recommend its use. The way the documentation works has been changed, and we are in the process of updating that. So how do we recommend that you actually run Zap in automation? And the recommendation, one of the recommendations is what we call the package scans. So the package scans are in Docker, in our Docker images. And what I will do is I will switch over again to the Zap website, and we go to documentation. Then we've got a whole section on Docker. So we actually have a whole set of different Docker images. And so we've got the stable release, so that is updated whenever we have a full Zap release. So that is currently Zap 2.10. We have a weekly release that's typically built every Monday. And we have a live image, and whenever Zap changes, whenever we make any changes from the command to the source code, then that will get built. So we've actually had cases where people have reported something to us, we put in a fix, and we've said, been able to say, well, can you try it out? Been able to point them to Docker image for them to try. We also have a bare Docker image, which is good can be ideal for CI environments. So that gives you a kind of summary there. But then what we have is these package scans. So the package scans, we've got 3 different ones. And the first one is the baseline scan. So this is a time-limited spider. And all it does is it explores your application. It does not do any active attacking. It does not do any active scanning. So this is actually very useful if you want a faster scan. So obviously it doesn't go into as much depth as some of the other scans. It will not be testing your application it will not be trying to find cross-site scripting, SQL injection, any of the attacks where you actually have to, or any of the vulnerabilities where you have to actually actively attack the application. However, it will still find a lot of interesting things. So it'll find things like missing security headers. It will find missing cross-site request forgery tokens, those kind of things. And what it does is it is spidering your application. And by default, it'll only do that for 1 minute. By default, it will use the traditional spider. And then it will passively scan those URLs. And it will finish within a couple of minutes. So it's pretty quick. And this means it's something that you can actually do in line as part of your CI/CD pipeline. When I was at Mozilla, we actually had this whenever applications were promoted from development to staging or from staging to production. One of these scans would run, and if they failed, then the promotion would get rolled back. So this is actually a very useful scan because it runs so quickly. So if you think of DAS scanning as something that takes hours or potentially days, then it doesn't necessarily have to. However, obviously, it doesn't find as much as a full scan does. So the next one is the full scan. Actually, I'll go into the baseline just to give you a little bit more information. So the baseline scan, all you really need to do is specify a target. But there are a whole load of other options. You can specify a configuration file. and you'll see a bit more details about later. You can specify how long to spider for. By default 1 minute. If you put 0, then it will spider until it actually can't find anything else. Then you have various options for reporting, whether it's HTML, Markdown, XML, or JSON. We have options for including alpha passive scan rules. By default, we actually include both the release quality ones and the beta quality scan rules, but you have an option to include the alpha ones as well. Various other things, including you can actually specify a context file, and you've got various options for things to ignore. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to show you this from the command line. So here I'm going to run the baseline scan using the stable image, and I'm actually going to run it against example.com. And that is legal for me to do because, as I said, this is not actively attacking anything. So I will kick that off. You'll see this. We're getting some debug messages saying it's not finding a hooks file. I didn't specify one, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So I'll just flip back while that's running. So we do actually have various other options. If you specify a context file, then you can actually also specify a user. So we can do authenticated scans, but that is a little bit complicated to set up. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of details, but I will talk a bit more about that. But you can also specify ZAP command line options. So remember that -config option I mentioned before. So you can specify any of the ZAP options that way. See how, and there we have. So it is now run. So if I scroll back up to the top, we will see that it actually found a total of 4 URLs, and it then tells you the passive scan rules are passed. So we can see that didn't find any vulnerable JavaScript libraries, no cookies with missing HTTP only flag, etc., etc. When we get down to later on, we'll actually see, this is where you see some of the warnings. So by default, everything is a warning because we don't know whether it's something you want to fail on or not. We can see incomplete or no cache control. You can see X-frame header is not set. So missing STS header. So you can see that ZAP is actually finding really useful things. So that is the baseline scan. As you can see, there's quite a lot of options here, but it is all you actually need to do is to start off just specifying the target. So it's very simple to get started with, but it is fairly flexible.
Regarding the flexibility, there would already be one question. I'll
Excellent.
ask it, but let me know if it fits better for the end. So the question will be, what is the best, easiest way to add a new check to the baseline scan? Is it necessary to be coded in Java?
No. So it's probably well, a couple of things. I mean, you can definitely code it in Java. However, you can specify script scan rules. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to switch over to the ZAP desktop. So what we have, for those of you who don't know about ZAP very much, ZAP has a really powerful scripting capability. And one of the things you can do is you can create active scan rules and passive scan rules. And one of the great things, and here you can actually see I've got loads. I mean, here's one for, again, checking for HTTP only cookies, but you see a whole load of different things here. So these are just ones that I've got installed from the community scripts. So what you can do is you can actually include your own script rules. If you've got rules that you think would be useful to include in ZAP generally, then please let us know. ZAP is a community project. We want people to get involved, and we love to get new rules, whether they're written in Java or in scripts. Talking about that, let's just go and see. If I go to ZA Proxy on GitHub, then you'll see the community scripts. So these are scripts that have been provided by people like yourselves. So they're all different types of scripts, including the passive ones. And It's a little bit tricky to include these, but it is definitely doable. And I will talk a little bit more about that in a sec, actually. So yes, you can include your own passive scan rules and active scan rules to answer the question. Any other questions for now?
Not as far as I see it for now.
Okay, well, I will carry on, but yeah, please interrupt me with any more questions like that. That's great. So one thing you can, so here again, on the website, you'll see the example output, very similar to what you saw on my command line. But what we can do is we can actually generate a configuration file. So there's a -G option for generating configuration file. And then once we've used it, you can, once we've generated it, we can use it. So a configuration file will look like this. And basically, it lists all of the rules available, gives their ID. Then this is just for your benefit, really, or for our benefit. And the default is worn. What you can do is you can change these to either ignore, to completely ignore the rule, or you can change it to fail. And that means that the baseline scan will fail, will exit with a different code. So you can tell the difference whether the baseline just had warnings or whether it had failures. And you can actually ignore things. So you can set specific rules or regexes as out of scope. And you can do that either for everything, or you can do it for specific rules. So the configuration file is particularly useful. So you can actually say, if there are particular rules that you're really not interested in, you can ignore them, or the ones which are particularly important to you, then you can make sure that your build fails rather than actually just getting a warning.
Simon, we have received another question from the community, and it's well, it actually asks, well, how do you deal with web pages where authentication is required or a CSRF token? So exactly what you mentioned, you would not dive in. So maybe if you find space somehow to include that.
I will cover authentication later, but I won't go into it in great detail because it's complicated. But yes, I will talk about authentication later. And some people are doing authenticated package scans. I can assure you of that. So that is the baseline scan. Then we have other options. We have the full scan. And this is kind of very similar, except that instead of just doing the passive scanning, Zap then does the attacking. It does, I'm not going to test this against examples.com in this case, and I'm not going to test it at all here because it will take too long. But this is where you're doing the active scanning, you're actively attacking an application. So obviously you should have permission to attack any applications you run this on. And in this case, by default, the spider has no limit. You can change that here, so you can put in whatever number of minutes you want. I didn't mention, I can't remember mentioned or not, but we have this option for the Ajax spider as well. So by default, we just use the traditional spider. So traditional spider is very good for traditional web applications. It doesn't work so effectively for modern web applications. So if your application uses a lot of JavaScript links, then the Ajax side of Spider is more effective because it launches browsers and clicks on things. So the Ajax Spider will handle modern web applications, but it will take a bit longer because it is launching browsers to click on things.
So does this also mean it will handle full single page applications too?
Yes, it will. With a caveat that I'll mention later on. But one thing I'll mention is that by default, the Ajax Spider uses headless browsers, which makes it ideal for using in automation, CI/CD. So the full scan is just like the baseline scan, except there's no, by default, there's no time limit for the spider, and it goes ahead and does the attacking. Then the API scan is similar again, but this is aimed at APIs, and we can actually support OpenAPI, SOAP, or GraphQL. So you give it a target and a format. So the target can be a a local file or a URL, and kind of helps so we know it's OpenAPI, SOAP or GraphQL. And what Zap will do is it will import that definition, and then it won't run the spiders because we're testing an API and chances are the spider won't work as well, but we'll actively scan your API from there. And one thing I think is worth noting about the API scan is this actually does use some script scan rules. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the ZA proxy repo, and under Docker, so we have some HTTP send. Actually, these are HTTP sender scripts rather than passive scan rules, but these are, so the API scan actually includes these. So they're part of the Docker image, but it then configures Zap to use these because we want to do things like alert on HTTP error codes and unexpected content types. And you can go in and see what they look like. But that is an example of included, so you can kind of rip off that example if you want. But if you have any problems including your own scan rules, then just get in contact with us. And for that, I will mention we've got this community tab where we've got all the ways you can get in touch. So that is the API scan. And one thing I'm going to mention is scan hooks, because all of these options actually have a -- hook option. And if we have a look at scan hooks, then what you'll see is you can specify a Python file. And if you then have the right function definitions, then these functions will get called. So the way the package scans work is they run in Docker and they launch Zap in daemon mode, and then they communicate with Zap using the Zap API. So what you can actually do is the scripts that control the Zap API, if you specify a hook file, then the controlling script will call your script at the relevant times. And we've got a full list of the hooks there. And what that means is if you want to change how the package scans work, then you can pick a suitable hook and you can then implement whatever you like. And because most of them, where relevant, will actually have a Zap object that allows you to call the Zap API. So you can call the Zap API to do whatever you want. And that could be something like, say you want to wait until something has happened. You could actually put a sleep in. I think we've actually got an option for sleeping anyway, but you know, if there's something, if you're doing something else on the command line and you're running your own set of tests, then this other process could write to a file on disk to say, right, we've finished the. So you say you've got unit tests, you want to proxy those through Zap, you could proxy them through Zap. Then when those tests are finished, you could write to a file in the file store, and your hook could actually sit there after actually accessing the target. It could actually sit there waiting until that file is created on the file store and then go, okay, great, now we can carry on spidering and active scanning and all the other things. So these scan hooks are incredibly powerful. You can see we've got whole hooks, a whole load of in so many different places, anywhere we thought was kind of relevant, and you have access to this Zap object, which means you can then call the API. So the package scans are pretty flexible, but with the addition of hooks, they are very, very powerful. So that is what I was going to talk about, the option for running Zap in Docker, the package scans. The next thing I want to talk about is GitHub Actions. So for that, I will switch back to my browser. And this time I'm going to go to the GitHub Marketplace. So if you go to the GitHub Marketplace and search for OWASP or Zap, either should do, then you will see we have the baseline and the full scans on there. And these are pretty much the same thing. So these do actually run the Zap package scans. The difference is you are actually running these on GitHub's infrastructure, not your own. So that makes it a little bit cheaper and a little bit easier. And it'll look very similar. You've got a target. You've got the Docker name because so by default we're running the stable version, but you can change these weekly. You can specify the rules files, the command line options, but you can also one of the important differences is you can actually raise issues. So if you specify an issue title, then we'll actually specify a token. Then Zap will raise issues against your against the repo, and that repo can be a private one. So if you include this action in it, so if you have a public or private repo, then the GitHub actions are actually really great. And you can schedule these using standard GitHub action features. And we will store information with these scans so that we won't actually keep on raising issues. If you close the issue and it hasn't been fixed, then the action will actually open them again. But what happens if you actually fix the issue, then the next time the scan will run, the scan will actually automatically close it for you. And if you want more details about how to use those, then go to the blog. And I think, yep, so we have actually probably doesn't look like it's there, but if we scroll down, then we should see that we have dynamic application security testing with Zap and GitHub Actions, and there's a corresponding one for the passives for the baseline scan as well. And these blogs actually show how we've set it up on zaproxy.org. So we go through exactly the process, and this is what we use to test zaproxy.org. That is a static site, so it's unlikely to have anything too seriously wrong with it. But we just thought it was a really good example of showing you how to set these things up, and that blog post goes through the details of how you can set that up, and you can see what we've done as well. So those are the Zap GitHub Actions. So any questions about those?
Yes, we actually have one.
Excellent.
Is it possible to dynamically specify Swagger or Open API URLs for Zap? So using it from a CI/CD job so that it can actually import or discover these target API endpoints with every CI/CD run?
Yes, so if we go to the Docker details and the API scan, then you'll see that the -target, it can be a local file or it can be a URL. So if you can pass that URL in somehow, then that is the URL we will pull down the definition from. Obviously, you've got to make sure that it is available within, well, the Docker container. So you might have to do a bit of messing around with the networking.
Cool, thanks a lot.
Okay, so that is all I was going to say about the GitHub Actions. And the next part is the API and daemon. So I've already mentioned that the package scan actually uses the API and daemon, but if for whatever reason the package scans aren't flexible enough for you, then you can do this yourself. So all you need to do is start Zap in daemon mode using the -daemon flag, and then you have access to the whole API. What I'll do is I will just switch back to Zap. Actually, what am I actually going to do is go here to the browser, because I'm going to point to my browser at the host and port that Zap is listening on. And you'll see that the first link you get is a link to the local API. So this is the Zap API, and this actually, I can actually interact with this. So these are all the components, the Zap components that actually support the API. And it really does help to have a bit of knowledge about Zap and the Zap desktop. because we're using the same concepts, which isn't too surprising because the UI kind of maps down to the data structures, and then the API is kind of mapping to those as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start a new session, clear all that out of the way. And what I'll do is I'll just go to Spider, and for every component you have what we call views. So these are kind of read access, and you can see you can read all of the options, information about the URL's been added, loads of information in there. And then there are actions, things which actually do things. So I'm going to scan, and I'm going to run it against budget, going to recurse, and so you can see Zap in behind me there. And if I start the Spider, you'll see it actually ran really quickly. So Zap has now spidered budget, and there we go. And this is one thing, it's actually really useful. I mean, it kind of seems a bit strange that you can use the API with the desktop, but it's really great when you're trying to understand what's going on, either when you're starting out or if you're kind of trying to debug problems. You can actually run all the API commands against Zap directly, against the Zap desktop, and you see what's going on. But if you haven't got the access to the desktop for whatever reason, basically the API gives you pretty much access to pretty much the same things. So you can get the status of that scan. I can't remember what it was, but by default, I'll pick the last one. You can see status 100%. So the Zap API gives you nearly the same access to everything that you can access via the desktop. There are a few things you can't do, but most of them are around things like fuzzing and the like, things which are more manual processes. We do want to actually get the Zap API to cover everything you can do via the Zap desktop, but we focused more on the things that you're more likely to automate. And right now, you can do nearly everything via the Zap API. And what I will mention is if you go to the Zap documentation, then you'll see an API details, and basically we've got a huge amount of documentation about the API. So you can go into details about all of the different commands, different API endpoints, and we've got examples in Python, Java, Shell. So there's a lot of documentation about the API, and it gives you, as I said, pretty much full access to Zap.
We have a follow-up question
Excellent.
from Andreas regarding this API scanning. He's asking, is it possible to run API scans on a port that does not require proxy protocol support? And if so, how?
I think if I could rephrase that, because that's one I experienced myself as well. The question should go regarding not the scans themselves, it's more about the API of Zap itself, because as far as I know, it's running on the port which you would use to interact with Zap's proxy mode. It's the same port, right?
Yeah, it is.
Is it possible to run the API on a separate port? Because due to restrictions, for example, in our case, it will be an OpenShift, it is not possible to access that port.
So you want a different port, or?
Not the number in general. It needs to run somewhere where it does not need to support the proxy functionality.
Okay, so we do have, let me have a look. We've got an option for local proxies, so you can create new proxies if you like. But you're saying you don't want to proxy, you just want to access the API.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I mean, you can't, is that from, I mean, you can still access that from, so if you're running within Docker, you'd be able to access it within Docker, is that right?
Well, the setup is a little different. I think it's probably too specific. So maybe go on, and then we come back to that question later.
Yeah, this might be a good one to follow up. What we do have is we've got a Zap user group, and that would be really good because it's a good place to discuss things like that. So I'm not really sure about this, and that'd be a really great place because other people might have hit that, and if they don't, then it'd be a good place for them to learn about it. And if Zap doesn't support it, we can look into actually supporting it.
All right, thank you.
One thing I will mention is the API has options, and one of the things I've disabled the API key just to make it easier for myself doing demos, but you may well, you wouldn't want to do that in a live environment, or if you're actually testing, doing manual testing against a potentially malicious application, web application.
So after this quite hard question, maybe there's a quick one from Kartik, who's asking regarding, you presented the GitHub extension. So he's asking, do you plan to publish an official extension for Azure DevOps too?
So we haven't got, let me make a note of that. It's not planned at the moment, but that is something which we'll be very interested in, yes. So it's something we should think about. And that will actually tie in with something that, well, this new framework, which I'll talk about in a bit. Any other questions so far?
We're good to go.
Excellent. So what I want to talk about now is just kind of the kind of things you need to think about with automation. And the very first one is what kind of tests you want to run. And with CI/CD particularly, it's kind of how long do you want to take. So with DAST, dynamic application security testing, it can take a long time. And it all depends of, you know, how long you want something to take compared with how effective do you want it to be. If you actually want to have some tests that run in line, and by that I mean actually interrupt the build process so that you cannot actually merge a pull request, for example, until the test pass, then you probably don't want to run a scan that's going to take half an hour, 2 hours, 10 hours, anything like that. You only want to run tests that are pretty quick. So that's why something like the baseline scan is great. It is a scan which will take a couple of minutes, and it will still pick up things like, you know, you're missing security headers, missing cross-site request forgery tokens, and as I mentioned, you can put your own tests in there. So if you've got things, I mean, maybe you just need something like you've got to have a footer on every page with a link to legal or something like that. You could create, it's very easy to create Zap passive scripts or any Zap scripts really to test whatever you want, even they're very, very specific to your environment. So you can create your own scripts, you can put them in there, and you can make sure that any pull requests do actually conform to this baseline requirement, the baseline requirements that you have. So if you want to run something inline so that it interrupts the build, then you want it to be quick, and that means you probably want to use the baseline scan. If you want to actually do more thorough testing, then you're probably looking at scheduled scans. So whether that's overnight, over the weekend, and of course you can do both. So you can have a baseline scan which interrupts the build if it fails, and then you can have a more thorough scan which runs over the weekend or overnight. You can actually have a full scan where you're targeting very specific things. So if you want to say, if you've got a particularly large application, you could just say, okay, we just want to test for cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. And you can create a full scan which only looks for cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, and that will take significantly less time than if you're scanning for everything. So you could run that every night, and then you could run the full scan over the weekend. So you've got to kind of think of what tests you want to run, how long they're likely to take, and you know what the best options are, and just play around with them, try them out. And what I think is really important is test locally first and do that manually. So this is one great advantage of the Zap Test Stop, is you can actually see what's going on. And this is really important for various reasons. The first is, does Zap actually understand your application? So the first thing I would do if I was looking to automate a testing, automate Zap against a particular application, is I would run the the spider against the traditional spider from the Zap desktop. And then you've got to work out whether that spider was effective or not. And for that, it kind of helps to know the application, so whether you actually want to do it manually. But the key thing is the traditional spider will not work so well with modern web applications. So if you've got a lot of links created by JavaScript, it probably won't work. So run the traditional spider and have a look and see if it matches your understanding of the application. If you don't understand the application, then you need to understand the application before you can actually automate Zap testing it effectively. If the traditional spider doesn't work so well, use the Ajax spider and make sure that that works well. And then you've got to look at things. There's a whole set of things you need to worry about, including things like single page applications, applications that use data-driven content. So what you will need to make sure is that Zap understands your application effectively and as efficiently as possible. Things like data-driven applications, you could end up with thousands of URLs when actually there's only a relatively small number you need to test because the content's all coming from a database. I had that with one particular Mozilla website. The first few scans took like 10 hours, I think, because a lot of content was coming back from the database. And once I kind of filtered that out, it got down to 40 minutes. So it can make a huge difference. I'm not going to have enough time to go through all of that in this talk, but I've got some videos. I can point to those later. There's a lot of videos of helping you to work out whether Zap is understanding your application effectively or not. Then try automating it, and try automating it locally. So the Docker package scans are particularly useful for this, or use Zap in API and daemon mode. But try it out locally and then try automation. And I've got a bit about Zap configuration, because if you've got to configure Zap to understand your application, then you need to know how that configuration is stored before you can put it into automation. And you need to think about the results. So if you're using the Zap GitHub Actions, then we do have the option to actually integrate with the GitHub issue trackers. But if you're not going to do that, then you need to consume those results and work out what you want to do with them. And my recommendation is, initially, if you're a security person setting up these tests, this is what I did when I was at Mozilla. Whenever we started scanning a new website, I made sure the results came to me rather than developers, because I wanted to make sure they were actually valid and they were reasonable ones to put for the developers. So don't go and set up Zap full scan against hundreds of applications and just chuck the results at your developers. You will not be popular. So make sure you, as a security professional, get to see these results first. Or if you're a development team setting these things up, that's okay, but have a look at the results and don't just assume you've got to do things just because Zap is reporting something. It's worth understanding what the results mean and whether they're actually important to you or to your business. And I said I'd mention it, but authentication is a pain. It is a complete pain. And that's not just for Zap, it's for any kind of tool interacting with web applications are authenticated. So my pro tip, if you can avoid authentication, then do so. If you can run your application without authentication or a test mode, then do that. You can run particularly the package scans. You can run these in a safe environment and turn authentication off, or if you've got single sign-on, and you can replace that with simple form or something like that, then do that. It makes things so much easier. If you can't do that, then always go for the simplest option. So if you can actually specify, if you can generate a token, then use that. And we actually have what I'll just switch back to the browser again, because go back to the website. So if I just go to actually download and find the release notes, something we introduced recently with Zap 2.10 is we actually have authentication headers via environmental variables. And this was very much we're really thinking about the CI/CD case here. So basically, we have these 3 environmental variables. If you specify ZAP auth header value, then that is added to every request. And that is added as an authorization header, unless you specify ZAP auth header, and then that's the one we'll use instead of the authorization header. And if you specify ZAP auth header site, then basically then the header will only be included in sites whose name includes the value. So you can actually then make sure that your authorization header doesn't get sent off to remote sites. So you can just give the whole site name or a part of it, part of your company name or whatever. So this, if you can, the easiest option really, if you can specify an authorization header, then this is the way to go. If you can't do that, then we're really into ZAP authentication, which is complicated for very good reasons. And again, I haven't really got time to go through this in default. I've recorded quite a few talks about this, so do go online to have a look at those. Basically, what you need to do is you need to actually configure ZAP to understand authentication. And we support manual authentication, form-based, HTTP, NTLM, JSON-based, and script-based. So you can actually create your own authentication scripts. We've got examples for things like JuiceShop. And if actually I go back to the website, then so under videos, I've actually got a ZAP automation get my teeth in automation workshop, and in there actually got a whole load of videos about the command line package scan, automated with JuiceShop, simple authentication, and even go as far as single sign-on. So ZAP will handle all of these things, but it will be complicated, and you will need you really will need to test this locally to make sure it's working. And pro tip, if you do set up authentication, make sure you put some tests in there to tell you that it's working. I did have a case where I set up authentication against a particular website, and it was all working well, and then the test started failing. And they failed because ZAP wasn't finding enough URLs, and it wasn't finding enough URLs, and I was checking that, and it's just as well I was, because the developers actually changed how the authentication worked. So I was having to do some fairly nasty scripting to get ZAP to authenticate against this website. But as soon as the authentication method changed, as soon as they changed the authentication, the ZAP authentication failed. So make sure you are doing some sort of SANSI checking that your authentication works and carries on working.
There's just a quick question regarding, sure. Do you have a solution for CAPTCHAs regarding authentication? But
yes, yeah, turn them off. CAPTCHAs are there to prevent automated testing. So if you actually want to do automated testing, then you've got to work out, which would you rather have? So this is, they are there to prevent tools like ZAP from working. So really, if it's your application, then work out a way of turning it off. Otherwise, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot.
Thank you.
I mean, there are kind of ways. I mean, if you've got a way of actually generating the token, then, but I've generating what the capture value is by some sort of backdoor thing, then you could put it in via a script, but it would be horrible. So basically, can you work out a way to automate it in some way via some sort of scripting mechanism? If so, yes, you can do it. You'll be able to do it via ZAP scripts one way or another. But if you can't work out a way to automate it from the command line using any scripting language, then ZAP doesn't have any magic, I'm afraid. So you need to work out a way to avoid it. Any other questions?
Yes, we actually do have.
Excellent.
A few from Andreas. Great. So the first one is retrospective. You mentioned that while a full scan can take a lot of time, you were able to kind of optimize that time by understanding the application and figuring out what really is required to scan. Are there other tips or ideas you have how we can reduce the runtime of an active scan?
Yeah, so if we go to the ZAP blog, then actually, no, I think it's under documentation. We have frequently asked questions. This is a very useful section. And if we go down to scanning, then how can you speed up scans? And that actually takes you to a Mozilla blog post I wrote a little while ago. And this gives you a whole load of information. So it explains how scanners work and how to identify bottlenecks, hardware networks, loads of information. And so there is actually, I should put an addendum to our frequently asked questions because there are some newer features which will actually help things, but that's a pretty good starting place. Any other questions?
It's not, maybe you'll come to that anyway. The next one would be regarding the report format. I don't, you didn't mention anything about that, but the question goes in the direction that the current default report format, is it the one to use, or should a generation plugin that's still in alpha be used? Or
okay, yeah, okay. So this is where we don't have as good a story as I'd like, and this is something I do want to address sooner rather than later. So the default report you get from ZAP is, well, we get an XML report and a HTML report. Neither are particularly pretty. Obviously, the package scans have their own reporting options. So they have this kind of, you've got this format, which, so if you're using the package scans, you can use their format. If you're going your own way, it would be worth having a look at the add-ons. So I'll just go to the documentation. Actually, no, it's Marketplace. So we do actually have various add-ons which support. So not that one, but we've got a custom report and we've got an export report. Have a play around with those. Now, what we're planning on doing, we are actually planning on choosing one of these to be the one we're going to support going forwards. At the moment, the reporting code is in the ZAP core and it's very old and it's a pain to maintain because we can only push out changes when we do a ZAP release. We are going to adopt one of these add-ons, or we can decide one of these add-ons is going to be the one we're going to maintain going forward, and we are going to start making a lot of changes and making a lot of improvements. So that's something I intend to look at pretty soon as part of this new automation framework, which I will talk about very shortly. Any other questions?
Thanks a lot. Right now, we're clear again.
Excellent. So I'm just going to very quickly talk about ZAP configuration, and I'll actually go back here because we have this idea of a ZAP default directory or the ZAP runtime directory, and where that is will depend on your platform. So here's a frequently asked question about it, and we can see that on Windows 7 it's under users, under XP it's under documents and settings. Under Linux it's .zap, under Mac it's under library, and with weekly releases we actually use a different directory with _d on. But basically under that directory we then have a set of files and directories. Config.xml is key, so whenever I show you anything in the options, pretty much everything here is stored in that config.xml. So you can actually, what you can do is you can find any of these configuration items, and we have a Frequently asked question about how you do that. So how do you find a key to use? So basically it is an XML file, and if you find the key, then you can, that is how you specify it in the doc notation, and that's the format for the -config option on the ZAP command line, or the the file option where you specify -config file. Then you just put them all one per line. So we didn't really intend the XML file to be something you'd look at, but this worked out as a very convenient way. So if you tune your ZAP desktop to work exactly how you want, then you can actually essentially export these configurations and pass them in to ZAP when you run it from the command line. And then the other things I'll mention is if you do any configuration, particularly to do with authentication, but anything to do with context, then you export your context to the context, by default, the context directory. And if you run automation, you'll need to import that. Policies, if you want to create your own scan policy, they're by default stored in policies. Scripts are in the scripts directory, and the plugin directory is where we download ZAP add-ons. Just kind of mention that as well. So if you actually, as I recommend, get ZAP working locally first, then in order to put that into automation, you will need to kind of move stuff from these directories into your automation environment. Are there any questions about ZAP configuration? I kind of went over it very quickly, I'm afraid, but oh, didn't mean to do that.
There's nothing about the ZAP configuration. But as you give me the time to speak, then maybe I'll come up with one that's going back to GitHub Actions and Docker, and also the discussion we had regarding DevOps. If there's no longer a Jenkins plugin, how should we actually integrate in Jenkins when we can't do Docker or GitHub from Jenkins due to our environment restrictions?
Okay, so I mean, my normal answer would be to use Docker. So I wasn't aware that people had a restriction of not using Docker. But what you can do is you can start ZAP in daemon mode and then run the scripts against that. Now, this actually ties in quite well with the next thing I'm going to talk about, and that is the ZAP automation framework. And so I'll start on that, but if we have any other questions, we can come back to them. So what we're actually working on right now is something called the new ZAP automation framework, and this will actually it'll be a ZAP add-on, so we'll be able to release it on top of ZAP 2.10. And what it does is it reads a configuration file, and that configuration file is in YAML. And there are various reasons for it. One is because the package scans are tied to Docker. And we were aware that, I wasn't aware people couldn't use in Jenkins, but we were aware some people were unable to use Docker. And the reason the package scans use Docker is kind of a historical reason. There was no particular, it was just a convenient thing to use. Whereas the ZAP automation framework will essentially supersede the package scans, and it will not have a dependency on Docker. The package scans will still exist, but in most cases they will actually then call the automation framework when it's in a fit state. And this means that going forward, once this has been released, this will be the recommended way to run in Jenkins or any other environment as well. So the idea is that there will be a YAML configuration file, and it will define a set of things. It will define context, so you'll be able to define one or more contexts, giving URLs, exclude paths, and in time it will provide, you'll be able to put authentication details in there. That won't be in the first version, I can assure you. And you'll be able to specify certain things like, fading on error, fading on warning, progress to standard out, those useful kind of things. But then you will have a set of jobs, and those jobs will be things like installing add-ons, so you can install any non-standard add-ons, configuring the passive scan, and then actually overriding the passive scan rule configuration, so you can actually ignore certain rules or change the thresholds of certain rules, and run Spider, run both the both of the traditional spider and the Ajax spider, and it'll be able to do some fun things. So you can actually warn if we don't find enough URLs, or fail if we don't find enough URLs. So what I mentioned before about having to put your own checks in place if the Zap package scan doesn't find as many URLs as you expect, it'll be much easier for us to put these kind of checks directly in the automation framework. So we're going to put some of these things in, but we really want input. And because we don't have to put anything from the command line, it can be all in these configuration files. We can support a lot more options than we can do with the package scans. And again, you'll be able to run the active scan, all these kind of things. So the framework, excuse me, the framework should be much more flexible and much more powerful than the package scans, but will provide the same level of functionality, but more, to be honest. And they should be as easy to run. So this is work in progress. It's not been released yet. There is actually a pull request outstanding for kind of an early version. And this is what I'm going to be talking about in more detail in ZapCon, and the plan is for it to be released at some form for that conference. So I don't know if that answered the question about not being able to use Docker, but yeah, any follow-up questions on that or other related questions? Or actually, questions on any of the talks so far?
As of now, I see no questions that are open.
Well, that was all I was going to cover. And as you've seen, zaproxy.org has got loads and loads of content. And zapcon.io is the place to go if you want to sign up for the conference, or if you want to talk there. I will actually go back and talk about the videos, because as well as the automation workshop, we've got Zap in 10. So these are 10-minute episodes of Zap and the Zap Deep Dive series. So these are kind of 20 to 30-minute videos I'm doing in conjunction with Stackhawk, but it's just about Zap. And I've been doing a whole load of things, and including things like the sites tree. So if you want to know about how to get Zap to understand your application better, than the sites tree is a good one to look at. But that is, so if you want to learn more about Zap, do please have a look at those videos and the rest of that website, really. So any other questions turned up in the meantime?
There is one question that's phrased like this: are there any recommendations regarding how to add the reports to the build artifacts, meaning that is stored in the repo? So
yeah, so I think so. As part of the actions, we do that already. But what you'll see is we do actually. So here's the Zap Scan baseline report. So you will get this kind of summary report raised as issues. But if you do want to save the report somewhere, then yeah, I mean, you can, with Zap automation, you can always output reports in various formats. You can store them wherever you like. So it all depends on what you want to use them for, really.
Are you aware of a specific topic that already has been discussed by the user group? How this has been achieved? Like what didn't work well? What has been working well for others?
We actually get very little feedback on how people use Zap. We'd love to have more. So actually, one thing I will mention is we are planning on adding a new section to the Zap website called Success Stories. So if you're already using Zap and you're happy to publish a little bit of information about it, we'd love to hear from you. So please get in touch with myself directly. So we're collecting some initial stories. Once we've collected a few more, then we'll put those live. But we're always very keen to hear about people who have used Zap successfully or who have problems. So please go to the Zap user group to post anything like that there.
Thank you.
Wonderful. regarding the automation part, do you have any experience with SAP and Selenium integration?
Yeah, so I mean, depends what you mean by Selenium integration. The ZAP Ajax Spider actually uses Selenium, so we use it within ZAP internally. If you have some Selenium unit tests which are driving your application, then, I mean, if you've got any unit tests that drive your application, you can proxy through ZAP. I strongly recommend it. It's a great way for ZAP to understand your application better. So proxy Selenium tests through ZAP, please do. That's very recommended if you can do that. But I don't think there's any specific configuration. You need to just make sure you're proxying your browser, but I'm not sure there's any other specific configuration you need. So it should all just work, he said confidently.
Cool.
If it doesn't, then let us know.
It just came like when you talked about that, it just pinged an additional question in, which is you talked about whether SAP understands your application. Mm-hmm. How do I know whether SAP understands my application, and what can I do about it? And there might be future references.
Yep. So I said there's not really enough time to go into that in detail, but I'm pretty sure the best talk to watch is the ZAP sites tree, because the sites tree in ZAP, if I just switch over to it, this is ZAP's view of your application. It's kind of the internal view. So what you need to do is, one, you need to have some understanding of your application. If you don't understand your application, then you can't configure anything else to understand it. And one of the first things is kind of having a look at the URLs and the structure ZAP has found and asking yourself if that makes sense. What you might find for a single page application, you might find there's only one node here. That doesn't make sense because your application could actually have loads and loads of different functionality. So you will then have to configure ZAP to understand. And if we go into context, we have various things. We actually have this structure, and we have things called structural parameters and data-driven nodes. You can set them up this way, but it's actually easier to set them up by context menus. But I haven't got time to go into all of that. But that's the kind of thing you can do. But definitely have a look at the sites tree video, which will go into that much more detail. But basically, you have to understand your application of it, and you have to understand what ZAP's telling you about it, and match those two things up.
Very good. So as soon as we have a video, we're very happy, obviously. Thanks for pointing that out. Then I'll have a follow-up question on the topic of, well, how to deal with false positives. Is there a way to mark them so that they do not reoccur every time a scan?
It all depends on how you are using ZAP. I mean, the one thing, ZAP itself doesn't have any concept of different scans at different times. So it doesn't know that you're actually scanning the same application again. So you can flag them as false positives, but you have to do some configuration there. Obviously, if you're using the package scans, then you can configure them that way. But what I will do is go to the documentation and frequently asked questions. And somewhere down here is, how do I handle a false positive? So we have a frequently asked question all about that. So it will tell you everything you need to know. Hopefully, one of the first things it will say is, please report them to us, because we want to make sure that ZAP is as effective as possible. In some cases, it's really impossible for us or ZAP to tell whether something's false positive or not. But don't worry if that's the case. There are various configurations and thresholds that will help. And if they don't help, then let us know. We want to make sure that ZAP works the way you want it to work. And on that note, there's also, how do I report a false negative? So if you have if ZAP isn't reporting something you think it should be, then let us know as well. ZAP is a community project. Most people don't tell us how they're using ZAP, and we don't get as much feedback as we like. And we don't get as many we had lots of contributions, but we could always do with more. So if you're interested in getting involved with an open source project, please consider Zap and just get in touch with me. And there's always loads of things to do.
Back to the Selenium part, Matthias tells us that they had also a lot of issues with the Spider not detecting their application. So they started using this Selenium tests execution through Zap proxy, which worked out actually. So
good.
It was in the end possible to detect what the application was, but it was a whole lot of work to get this done. So the question here obviously is there something like a baseline script to support this?
Well, I've no idea what work was involved, so I can't say. This is where you need to get in touch with us. If you're struggling with Zap, then let us know. I mean, the Ajax Spider launches browsers and uses Selenium to click on elements, so we know that's not perfect. You know, the best option is always to have somebody manually exploring a web application, but obviously that's no good for automation. The second best option is actually having effective unit tests. So if you've got unit tests, great, proxy them through Zap. If you haven't got those, then well, the other thing is importing definitions. You've got application definitions, API definitions. We as you saw, we support OpenAPI, SOAP, GraphQL. If you haven't got those, then we're down to the spiders. And if they don't work well enough for you, then let us know. But if people don't let us know where they're struggling, then we can't help.
True. And when you have now, we consider we have integrated Zap into integration pipeline. So now I have a report, and what do you suggest usually to do with that? What are the next steps after integrating Zap into your pipeline, in your opinion?
So I think the best way is to actually make sure that one, to make sure that Zap is raising or only raising issues that are of real interest to your developers. So this is a question of you particularly if you're a security professional, going through the issues, and if there's anything that any rules that aren't of interest to your organization, then just disable them. So that's what I did at Mozilla. Went through and turned off a whole lot of rules that were reporting informational things or things we didn't care about. And then basically I configured it so that Zap would actually raise the issues automatically on the relevant repos. It wouldn't keep on raising them, so if an issue was raised, we would store that. And then when if developers just closed the issue, it would get reopened again if it wasn't fixed. But once it was fixed, then Zap would close that automatically. But that wasn't Zap, that was the infrastructure that I'd written around that. And that infrastructure is actually available, but an earlier version. So if we actually go to ZA proxy and the community scripts, under API, we have a mass baseline, but this is something that I haven't, 3-4 years ago. So it's not something I've looked at and it's not something we're maintaining actively anymore. But this may help, or it may not. But this is one thing where the GitHub Actions have a definite advantage in that they will raise issues for you. But other than that, that's all we're doing at the moment. And Zap doesn't have this concept of repeated scans. So this is something you've got to kind of build on top of Zap.
Well, the next one is maybe more for the two of us, maybe also for you. Do you know any big DACH companies that use Zap in their DevOps pipeline? DACH is the short for Germany, Austria and Switzerland, so maybe that's a bit far away from your home then.
So I know very little about who's using Zap. Based on, we've based on the stats, huge numbers of, we do think Zap is the most frequently used web application scanner in the world. But I've got a very short list of companies I know are using it, and I'm not sure I can share that either. So no, I don't. People, and I usually find out when people approach me at conferences and said, "Oh, by the way, we're using Zap," and that's the first I've heard of it. Most people don't tell us. That's one of the things about open source, So it's a shame, but we would. So if you are using Zap successfully, please let me know. I'd love to hear. And as I said, if you're happy to share your story, then definitely get in touch, and we'll feature you on the Zap success stories new section on the website.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for the great talk, by the way, as Taras mentioned also in a comment here. And some people are wondering where do you take your time from to do all this SAP work?
Well, I mean, it's not just me. We've got a core team. So most people are volunteering on Zap. We've got a core team, about 5 of us now. Lots of occasional volunteers, volunteer contributors. But I'm kind of lucky because I am now working on Zap full time. So I've been employed by a company called Stackhawk. I said there's a commercial, already built a commercial solution on top of Zap, which I won't mention anymore because it's an OWASP conference, OWASP talk now. But as part of that, what I'm doing at Stackhawk is focusing on Zap and the Zap community. So that's my job. So I'm very fortunate in that regard.
So one is very short one, I guess. Do you have experience with SAP on OpenShift?
No, I don't. Nice and easy.
Nothing that speaks against that, I guess.
Where Zap runs, if you've got a JVM, Zap will run on it. So we try and make sure Zap runs wherever it can, but yeah, I haven't tried OpenShift at all. I'm not aware of any problems. Put it that way.
Do you have a personal an idea or a personal opinion on what setup would be ideal to go with to initiate long, full scans via Jenkins while not blocking the agent for too long? So something like start Jenkins, start the job, then do the scan, fail, but don't mess up with an agent.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a while since I've set up any Zap scans on Jenkins. I mean, basically Zap has to run somewhere, and Zap has to sit there doing quite a lot. And if Zap takes an hour to scan something, it's taking an hour to scan something. So Zap will be sitting on a real or virtual machine somewhere, humming away, and your infrastructure needs to cope with that. Whether if you've got, I mean, with Jenkins, you can do all sorts of fancy things like kickoff. You can create, I mean, I think at Mozilla they were doing things like creating new virtual machines on the fly for certain things. There's all sorts of wonderful things you can do, but I am not an ops expert, and I know these things are possible, but I would hate to recommend. But basically, you've got long-running things that you want to kick off. So it's not a Zap problem per se. It's just a kind of this is the profile of the type of jobs you want to run.
Yeah. And then we'll have a last one, I guess. Are you using the default policies like high, low, medium, or if not, how are you setting them up, and how do the different levels affect the number of findings? I have no idea regarding what policies they mean, but okay. You do. I guess.
So the scan policies give configuration for the scan rules. Scan policies particularly, they affect the active scan rules rather than passive scan rules. And with the Docker containers, we include a set of standard policies. This comes down to kind of strength and thresholds. So pretty much every rule supports strengths and thresholds, which makes Zap insanely configurable. And strengths come down to, it's essentially how many requests a rule makes. So when we're aware that we've got this balance between how effective Zap is and how long it takes. And that all comes down to how many requests you make one way or another. So if you have a low strength, the finger in the air kind of thing is every rule will make around half a dozen requests, up to half a dozen requests per parameter per page. Medium strength is around 12. High strength, it's around 20, 24. And we got an insane level, and that's not, you're not supposed to use that for automation because it's, yeah, we're just going crazy at that point. So you can configure that. So the scan policies kind of set those at low, medium, high. Can't remember if we include the insane one or not, but that's affecting everything. But you can actually configure them either across all of the scan rules, or you can change each scan rule individually. So obviously, the higher the level, the longer it will take, that particular rule will take, and potentially the more things it will find. If you go shorter, you'll potentially find less things. So this is very much about how many attacks these rules will make and how long it will take. Then we've got thresholds. The thresholds are, at the low threshold, the rules are more likely to report things. This means you're more likely to get false positives, but less likely to get false negatives. Then if you've got a high threshold, you're less likely to get false positives, but you're more likely to get false negatives. So they've got these two different configurations, and they apply to all scan rules, or you can configure them to individual ones. Now, most of the time, when you get started, don't worry about these things. By default, everything's on medium. That's kind of what we think is a sensible level. However, if you are particularly interested in one particular type of vulnerability or a couple of types, say they're particularly bad for your application, or say you've had particular problems before, historically this particular application's had SQL injection vulnerabilities. Well, in that case, it might be better to have those particular rules set at high level rather than medium. Or there's certain things you're finding the rules are taking a particularly long time and you're not so worried about them, but you don't want to get rid of them, then run them at a low strength rather than medium strength.
Cool. Thanks a lot.
No problem.
At this point,
nice.
I would have a very last question, and then I'm happily letting you go.
Oh, row away.
Right, all right. Do you have any experience regarding the import of SAP results into a tool like Defect Dojo or similar?
No, nice, easy. Right, I'm out. So I am aware that quite a few tools support Zap. We have third-party products and services. So as I said, there are various services that we know are built on top of Zap. And if you're a Zap supporter, then you get bigger, bigger mention. Then we've got integrations. So we know that there are integrations with Denim, with Faraday, Defect Dojo, Dradis, Sniper, EdgeScan. We've not been directly involved with any of those. So you really need to kind of talk to the relevant companies or teams behind them. And we've got some Zap training courses again. None of these things are kind of endorsed by either us or the Zap team. We're just including these things for interest.
Thank you very, very much, Simon.
A pleasure.
The next presentation is already around, and we're going to talk on the 14th of April with Aaron and Matt from the Defect Dojo core team. They are actually presenting us that tool. So if that's something of interest to you, you as a listener, make sure that you mark that date in your calendar and join us on the next OWASP Switzerland event. Thanks everyone, and have a good one.